you can innovate on the market and product definition, and then you can innovate on business model. And all of those have huge value, particularly if you can do all of those, but you don't want to be doing all of those at the same time.
Welcome to the Lab to Market Leadership Podcast. Too many advanced science and engineering companies fail to deliver their innovations from the lab to the market. We are on a mission to change that. My name is Chris Reichhelm, and I'm the founder and CEO of Deep Tech Leaders. Each week, we speak with some of the world's leading entrepreneurs, investors, corporates, and policymakers about what it takes to succeed on the lab to market journey. Join us. I'm very excited about this week's podcast. We're talking to ScottWhite, the co-founder and former CEO of Pragmatic Semiconductor. Now, for those of you who don't know, Pragmatic is one of the UK's leading advanced materials and semiconductor growth stage companies. Scott and his colleagues set out on this journey 14 years ago, and they're still making progress. Having built up their operation to 300 people, having raised nearly $400 million in finance, the company goes from strength to strength, and that's not just a cliche. They really do. They're commercializing, they're building out their operation, they're becoming a global organization. As usual, I'm looking forward to diving deep with Scott to understand how he and his team have made this work. Let's get to it. ScottWhite, thank you for joining me.
Great to be here.
This series, in many ways, Scott, was actually made for individuals like you who have had the experience of taking a company from lab to market. And while I acknowledge that you have still some way to travel, you and Pragmatic still have some way to travel, you've gotten a fair long way down the track. And so I think a lot of people are going to be very interested in understanding about the journey that you and your team have been on. So thank you very much for joining us today. Where did the inspiration come from for ultra low cost semiconductors?
So I got involved in the field of semiconductors, specifically sort of non-conventional semiconductors, about 16 years ago. I just sold my previous business and was interested in kind of what else was interesting to do. And the field of printed and organic electronics was sort of floating around and starting to gain some traction and awareness. And what became clear as I looked at that sector was that there were lots of companies focused on different pieces of the electronic solution, like how do you print conductive tracks? How do you make flexible displays? Things like that. Nobody was solving the problem of how do you make the equivalent of the silicon chip thin and flexible and low cost enough to embed in printed or other type of material like that. And
was that a problem you had just thought of? You were thinking, God, we need this for a variety of applications, or did it come from somewhere else?
No, it was very much sort of something that was kind of known across the sector and being driven quite heavily by potential customers who were looking at this and saying, actually, without solving that bit, this doesn't actually do anything useful. So particularly driven by the smart packaging desire in fast-moving consumer goods. So you think of big companies who make the stuff you buy in a supermarket every day. They were kind of looking at how do you embed electronic intelligence into that packaging to allow it to interact with you as a consumer and to allow it to interact with its environment so you can do better management across the entire supply chain and product life cycle. And for that, you really need to be able to have a thin flexible chip to provide the brain of whatever intelligence you want to embed there.
Yeah.
So that was very much a kind of key demand, and there was obviously a massive potential for that. It was trillions of these items sold every year. But everybody that had tried to approach that was coming out from the perspective of what I, for want of a better term, I would call a technology religion. They were starting with a technology, whether it was printing, whether it was organic semiconductors, whatever it might be, and trying to figure out how you force fit that into, doing a thin, flexible chip. And inevitably,
No, please carry on.
inevitably those solutions really didn't work very well. They could sort of get to a very early proof of concept and demonstrate something in a lab, but didn't have industrial scalability. And so the genesis
Okay.
of Pragmatic Semiconductor, and the name was very intentional, was how do you do this in a way that is focusing on the business problem and then developing the technology you need to address that in the most effective way and in a way that is industrially scalable.
So from the very beginning, you were technologically agnostic. You didn't care
Yes.
really. Is that a fair assumption?
Yep, that's exactly right.
And was it just you in the beginning?
No, so it was co-founded by Richard Price, who's the
Yep.
CTO of the company.
Yep.
So he obviously drove a lot of the technical roadmap and
Yeah.
inventions for how we developed that. And then we
Yeah.
recruited early on a team that sort of filled the key pieces of expertise that we thought we needed to get to a proof of principle to say, well, how do you do this? But
Yeah.
always guided by that principle of all of our technology decisions have to be things that we can see a very clear route to
Yes.
scalability of the material supply chain and the
Yes.
equipment supply chain for high volume manufacturing.
Yes. And in the very early days then, who were the members of that core team? Just what kind of skills and capability did you have around the table?
So we had a few people that we brought in. One was what I would describe as a sort of jack of all trades. They're a
Mhm.
really
Mhm.
important
Mhm.
kind of person to have early on, someone that can
Mhm.
do a lot of different things and be very hands on in just making stuff happen.
But with a
We brought
foundation as an engineer?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. We brought in, so yeah, all of the early hires were technical. You know, that's
Yep.
that's what you need to get sorted first to prove that you've got something worth building a company on.
Yeah.
Um, Richard, the co-founder, had great experience on material science. That's his background, so kind of understood that side of things very well. But we brought in people from companies like Cambridge Display Technology and Plastic Logic. As part of the reason for basing the company in Cambridge was to draw on that expertise in the ecosystem of people that have done
Yeah.
similar kinds of things before and
Yeah.
had some of the basic understandings of how do you optimize the kind of processes we might need, what are the trade-offs in how you engineer that solution, and
Yeah.
to say how do you actually get that to the point of having some basic building blocks proven.
Yes. And can you describe for me a little how the ways of working early on? Did you and your team just rock up and start, okay, let's start playing with some ideas here? How did it work? What was governing you? And, were there systems and frameworks in place? What was it?
In terms of the way the company was set up, we had effectively two physical locations, both of which were
Mhm.
were somewhat virtual or shared. So we
Mhm.
we based, if you like, the management side of things. So myself and Richard in Idea Space, which was sort of set up as an incubator in Cambridge for small companies. So shared
Yeah.
access to offices and things like that, and gave us a sort of place to sit and have meetings. But then we basically developed a relationship with the engineering department at the University of Cambridge to be able to embed our R&D team within their environment. So we didn't have any physical facilities. We didn't have a budget to do that. We essentially self-funded for the first 4 or 5 years of the company. So everything was done in a way of sort of how do you minimize the cost of doing this? How do you leverage the ecosystem for facilities and services wherever possible? And so we managed to build a very good relationship with them. We did co-working on sort of research in a couple of key areas, but we actually
Yeah.
had our initial team of 4 or 5 people sitting in a room inside the university labs and able to access the clean room facilities to be able to do
Okay.
experiments.
Okay. And in terms of the engagement, you said you were completely led by the market need. How did that work in terms of engagements, in terms of time spent with potential customers or partners versus time spent in the office or in the lab?
Yeah, the high level requirement from the market was pretty clear, and
Mhm.
you could frame it very simply as we want the equivalent of a silicon chip that is thin, flexible, and an order of magnitude lower cost.
Yeah.
So that provided really enough of a starting point for the initial stage was very much technology focused on, okay, how do we have the basics of how do we do that? And for us, that's a combination of having the right material set and having the right basic processes for how you might pattern that material set in order to create transistors and diodes and the other key semiconductor building blocks that you need to build a complete integrated circuit.
Yes.
As we got
Yes.
to the point where we could make a transistor and start to think about doing something with it, that's when we ramped up our engagement with customers, say, well, what's the most simple thing you might be able to do with this that could be useful? So that we could actually
Okay.
focus then our initial demonstrators on something that could be translated into an example use case, even if it was something that may not have massive market
Yeah.
potential, but at
Yeah.
least it was something that the customer could envisage how that might fit into their use
I
cases
get it.
and do something.
And from a TRL perspective, where would that have been? Are you a 4? Are you a 5 at that point?
Oh, that would have been still pretty early. So I would probably have said that was sort of TRL 3 or 4.
Okay.
So maybe, yeah, I mean, it was very much lab-based
Yeah.
proof of
Yeah.
concept.
Yeah. But by the time you start
Just
to then take that out, by the time you start to take that out to potential customers, you've got a little prototype there, a little working prototype. And that's
yeah,
around
but
TRL
even that,
3 or 4.
yes. So
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was, to
That's
say,
early.
something that I wouldn't classify as being close to an MVP, minimum viable product. So it was very much a technology
Yeah.
demonstrator, and it was something that you could see it working in a lab environment, but was still some way from
I
anything
get
that
it.
customer could even think about putting on a product in the real world. So that was the first step of how do you get it to that
Mhm.
point. And then, of course, beyond that, as we developed the technology platform further, it was a combination of how do we expand the capability set towards what might be an MVP, as well as how do we evolve the implementation of that technology, the integration of it into something that looks more like a customer integrated product, so that you can move that towards something that was sort of closer to a TRL5, where you're starting to validate it in a customer environment.
How many iterations did it take for you to get to an approach that ultimately worked?
Uh, I probably couldn't even count the number of iterations. It's fair to say one of the things we've discovered about our technology platform that we developed that's really helped us is the fact that we could do very fast iterations. So, a challenge in conventional semiconductor manufacturing is the process cycle time is very long.
It is.
In a typical silicon manufacturing process, at a minimum, you're looking at 3 months of start to finish to produce a fabricated wafer. And in
Yep.
practice, it tends to be longer than that by the time you sort of schedule things in and so forth. With us, we've got a process that is, basically a couple of days now that it's optimized. And even earlier on, when it wasn't optimized, we're doing cycles in a week or two. And that means you can run experiments very quickly, try things, change things,
Yeah.
converge towards something that makes sense much quicker. But yeah, so
And
it's
that's
I would say the number of iterations would be probably in the hundreds,
okay.
in order
Okay.
to get
Okay.
to something that was close to what customers actually needed.
Yeah. And the time it took to get to that point from the time you started to get to the point where you have an approach and you're developing the confidence now. And I want to come back and ask you, what was it that the market said or did that gave you that confidence? But let me ask the question on timing first. How long did it take you to get to an approach that you thought, okay, this is scalable, this might be commercializable too?
There was really two key stages, I think, to the sort of R&D phase of the company. The first 5 years where we were self-funded was basically getting to proof of concept. So that had
Yeah.
a certain level of confidence that this could work and could work in a way that could be scaled, but still was some way from proving all of the elements of that. But
Hmm.
that got us to the point where we had enough confidence to say, yes, there's something here we can build on. There's
Hmm.
something here that we could understand well enough to look forward at what's the right business model for the company. It was very clear that the way we capture the value from that was actually to scale manufacturing ourselves rather than to license it or try and fit it into an outsourced manufacturing model. And that then drove the funding strategy for how we need to scale it. So that was the point where we brought in first institutional funding to be able to say, now we need more money to be able to take it to that next stage and start investing in the manufacturing transition. And then that second stage of the process was roughly another 5 years of building our first pilot scale fabrication line, which took us from proof of concept to a full end-to-end process, and working through then the hard engineering of how do you stabilize and optimize that to the point where you can see that it can deliver yields that are in the sort of 90% plus level where it needs to be, and that's from a set of tools that could have a reliable supply chain to scale up.
Yeah. And so we're looking at 10 years. We're looking at 10 years for the journey. And the point at which you said, okay, now we need to start going for scale. Now we need to start seeing if we can build a fab ourselves. What was there commercial validation at that point to say, we think we've identified this approach, we're getting a lot of positive feedback based on this. Now is the time to go. What was that?
Yeah, there was a lot of commercial validation. We had customer revenues from year one. So we already had customers who were paying us relatively small amounts of money, but effectively to prototype those things that I talked about earlier that are the simple demonstrators of what we've done. This is so transformational to the customer base that they were prepared to do that well before the technology was mature. Now, there's obviously different levels of customer validation, and probably the key steps for us were actually linked to some of the funding milestones. So in our Series A round, which was that sort of first transition of saying, okay, the next step is we need to think about building our own fab. We had Arm join as a strategic investor, and that was key validation of the technology, that this had the elements of scalability that were needed. And then our Series B, a couple of years later, was led by Avery Dennison, who is a key supplier into that packaging supply chain, and in particular are the global leader in radio frequency identification, which we had identified as the most interesting and scalable initial market for our technology. And so having the validation of the market leader in that sector being prepared to come and make a strategic investment, work very closely with us over the subsequent years to optimize it towards that application was a key validation point.
Okay, so it sounds a number of really interesting points there. One, you had revenues very early on. So this must have been one hell of a problem for them. Because
it was.
Generally speaking, at these early stages, that's not common.
It's not common. I mean, it's fair to say that getting early revenues there's positives and negatives to that. So in one sense, we had to do that because we were self-funding the business, that actually, generating some revenues to help focus what we were doing was important. And actually, we used that intentionally as a means of filtering what were the most interesting things that people might want to see done with the technology. Because everybody wanted to talk to us and everybody would love to have samples, and putting a price ticket on it is a great filtering function of, yes, we'd love to work with everybody, but we're never going to have the bandwidth to do that. So unless you're actually prepared, to put a bit of a stake in the ground and say, yes, this has tangible value to you, then actually this is just a discussion. It's not a real customer demand. So that was important early on, both in terms of funding the development of the business, but also actually helping provide some degree of focus, of all the possible things you could do with the technology. How do you actually narrow that down and say, here are the things that are most likely to be the initial applications?
Did some of that take you in a direction you hadn't thought of? Did it distract a little bit from where you thought you might go? Because I know in some other cases where clients take on early customers, I know this happens a lot with grant funding too. They need some of that early income, and so they go for it, and that's understandable. But at the same time, it can often distract them from their core mission. Did you find that was the case?
Very much so. I mean, as I said, there's positives and negatives to having that early revenue. One of the negatives is that it's not really representative of scale revenue. So it's important with investors coming in that they don't sort of assume that whatever revenue generating now is the starting point of the inflection curve where it's going to go exponential, because actually it's not. It's just a validation point. But yes, you're right. The other key problem was, you get pulled potentially in multiple directions, because if someone's prepared to pay for something in this application and then there's a different application, you sort of want to try and do both, because that helps you fund some of the underlying core technology development. But there needs to be at times some rationalization of that. So we had a couple of key points where we had to take a hard look at what we were doing and actually say, we're actually going to sort of pull back from certain areas or try and wrap up some things and just say, actually, we don't really think this is going to go anywhere, even though it could generate further revenue. So that was so we had to do that several times, during the company's life to order to focus that down.
But it sounds like a lot of the core validation would ultimately come from the ARM investment, as well as Avery Dennison, in terms of the technology approach, the scale of the ultimate market opportunity, those things.
They've certainly been very key supporters of the business, both in terms of internally providing honest feedback and having, being on the inside track and having a more open discussion with them than you might with an arm's length customer or partner has been very valuable. And yes, it's certainly been valuable in terms of sort of the ongoing validation to new investors that have come in since, because they've remained committed, even though, as always, these things take longer than you think they're going to do at the start. The fact that they've stayed kind of committed, in particular Avery Dennison, as sort of that representative of the lead market we're addressing, that was important. And you kind of asked earlier about sort of did that pull us in surprising directions? And actually, RFID is a good example. I kind of joke that I was on record when we started the business saying the one thing we're not going to do is RFID, because it doesn't use the full potential of the technology. You can do it with silicon. You can make the silicon chip very small and optimize it well enough to fit into a lot of these kinds of applications. But what became clear from discussions with Avery Dennison and others was there was still a step change that we could enable with our technology. And so even though it didn't necessarily leverage all of the potential of what our technology can do, it was a great starting point, because it was an existing market with a very clear need, and the ecosystem around it that just needed the new type of chip in order to take advantage of it. So it was an interesting learning experience of sort of how do you balance the goal to develop the most exciting long-term opportunities versus the practical approach of, yes, but there's a simple application that actually is big enough for us to build an early business on, and we're getting very strong customer demand, so let's follow that demand.
It comes back to being pragmatic.
It does.
Which you were, which is great. The relationship between, let's say, exploring and developing the commercial opportunity, the developing the technology capability, and then thinking of scale up. Those are the three big challenges which greet any advanced science and engineering company. What was the dynamic, if you think back to that time, between those groups within Pragmatic? Because you guys ultimately had success. So how did that come about? Was there a particular way of working? You've been involved in businesses for a long time. This is not your first rodeo. So you've been through this. So you can kind of look back and say, well, look, it took us 10 years still to get to where we are today. And we'll come on to that later. But we still made it. We've got a big opportunity, and you guys are going to make it. So what happened this time with that dynamic in the early years?
Yeah, and I mean, firstly, it's worth noting that it's taken us 14 years to get to where we are today. So we only talked about the first 10 of getting to that point. But we can come back to that. In terms of the dynamic, I think there's always an interesting balancing act, I think, in the earlier stages of how much do you listen to and follow customers. And we've talked about some of the aspects of this, that if you look at most of the really successful tech businesses, there's always an element of believing their own view of how things will evolve rather than what customers are telling them today. because actually, by definition, what you're trying to do with a transformational technology is change the way things are done. So many of the customers you might speak to don't understand that yet. So it's the classic, thing of Henry Ford. If he'd asked people what they wanted before the first car came out, they would have said they wanted a faster horse. It's that kind of analogy. So there's a balancing act there between, you don't want to be off in your own little box just developing technology completely divorced from the market, but actually having a sense of belief that what you're doing is going to deliver transformational value. It might take some time, but actually you need to, in some cases, drive that in directions that your customers aren't expecting to, because you believe you understand enough of how this could change the way they do things. And if you deliver that and then show that it can be done, then you get a different set of discussions with the customers. And so that really leads to, I think, what I would think of as a sort of iterative process of those customer relationships. So very early on, it's discussing things on a very, very high level, simplistic approach of people would like some intelligence in smart packaging. Nobody kind of really knew exactly what the form of that intelligence would take. So it's just, well, what can you do that gives a glimmer of that potential? That then evolves towards things like RFID, where you can say, okay, well, here's a real application that is on the simpler end of the spectrum, so we can envisage how the technology can deliver that. Let's focus on that. But at the same time, we want to drive the underlying technology platform to ensure it has applications that are broader than that. So we need to take our own view on what are the elements we need to develop and focus on there to be able to deliver that. And that long-term view of the things we might need beyond the initial applications, I think, has been key, because they all take years to develop.
Yeah, they do.
And so as we've gradually solved the challenges of how you translate the initial application into an industrializable solution, what you also then have is the platform underneath it has developed further and gradually opens up the opportunities to more and more things. So you don't end up just being a one-trick pony.
Did you guys divide and conquer? I mean, you must have done to a certain extent in those early years. Were you leading commercial?
Yeah, there's obviously an element of that, but I'd say in the early years, to a certain extent, you want people who can cover multiple bases. I mean, that's true even sort of within the technology area. You need people who aren't just specialists in one particular thing, but can work across different things and understand the interactions between different elements of what you need to do. And I'd say that applied on the cross-functional areas as well. So yes, in early days, I was leading most of our commercial engagements, but I also get quite heavily involved in the technology. So of our 250 patents or something that we've got now, something over 50 of those I'm a named inventor of. I like dabbling in that. It's one of the things I enjoy about early stage tech businesses is you actually are kind of to some extent influencing the technology development from the understanding of the market and what's important, and hence how you drive that. But of course, as the company matures, that gradually becomes more and more specialized. So we started to bring in people who are driving business development and then sort of other commercial and marketing activities.
When did you do that?
That I think we brought in first biz dev hire probably 3 or 4 years in company's life, and then sort of ramped that up post Series B, I think it was, when we were starting to get close to having an end-to-end process, and hence wanted to engage on a much more kind of structured and targeted basis with customers, and including starting to think about marketing and so forth. So in the very early days, as many other startups, we intentionally didn't do a lot of marketing. There's no point shouting about what you can do if you're still many years away from actually being able to do it at scale.
Exactly.
So ramping all those other areas, and there's always a challenge there of the timing there. You never get the timing quite right. You're either too late in doing that, or more commonly, you're a little bit too early, but actually you kind of want to be a little bit ahead of the curve usually on these things in building those functions. So you learn how to develop that function as a business, how to integrate it with the other activities, and use that as a means to help provide more input into the business in terms of its strategic direction.
That early commercial function, safe to say, was much more strategic business development oriented. And
Yeah, it's
partnership, exploring partnerships, sharing, sampling, qualifying, refining the understanding of the problem within the
yes.
customer.
So it evolved from kind of what I described before of almost using just willingness to pay as a filtering function for doing things. So, sort of a
Yeah.
big element of, let's get some contracts and gradually increase the size of those contracts with customers who are prepared to pay to help fund our development. And that evolved then towards a more considered approach, particularly in the area of RFID, which we identified of how do we build
Sure.
the right relationships with the right ecosystem partners. It's not just the customers, it's also the systems integrators or the people that might provide software or services around that and so forth. So how do you sort of start to pull that together into what's needed for the total product solution? And that then again is obviously something where there's a sort of commercial side to that, but it starts to reflect back into some of the technical aspects as well of, well, how do you think about this interacting with the other bits of the solution that are going to be needed by the end customer?
Absolutely. On that topic of integration, looking at your scale up, can you talk through a little of the process that would enable you ultimately to be able to scale this? And I've read up. I understand you have almost this fab as a service type process or offering that you've discussed in the past. To get to that level of refinement takes a lot of time, generally more than 14 years too, especially within such an innovative area. So was the scale up process based on other practices that are widely used, or was it novel?
So it's an interesting question, and I guess what I've come to view as the right way to do this, which is partially in hindsight of sort of looking at what we did and what worked and perhaps what didn't work quite so well, is that you have, as a company, as a tech company specifically, 3 degrees of freedom on which you innovate. You can innovate on the technology, which is usually a given. You can innovate on the market and product definition, and then you can innovate on business model. And all of those have huge value, particularly if you can do all of those, but you don't want to be doing all of those at the same time. So, the sort of simplified view of what we did, and it wasn't quite this structured as we went through it, but kind of the way it played out was the starting point is get the innovative technology there. So, you want to do that with a business model that is known and a product opportunity that is known, because that reduces the risk. If you've got a new technology platform, actually, the more other risks you can take off the table, the better. So that's where
That's smart.
delivering RFID and doing that as we took that all the way through to the chip product to deliver an RFID chip that could be used by companies like Avery Dennison as close as possible to a drop and replace for existing silicon chips. And so that was the starting point of focus on the technology innovation, but fix the other elements as much as possible. But then there was the opportunity to say, well, having done that, you can then start to think about innovating around the market opportunity and what else can you enable people to do that they might not have been able to do before that opens up even more opportunities. And so for us, that was starting to translate the technology platform into an open foundry. So in the same way that the silicon industry has over time evolved to not having fully integrated players like Intel, who have their own fabs and design their own microprocessors and sell those, most companies in the sector now are split between fabless companies who design and market the chips and the foundries like TSMC who manufacture them and focus on driving the process forward. And so what we saw was that if we could open up our process like as a foundry to those same chip designers, then actually we could leverage the potential of the technology in a way that was well beyond our own capabilities and create interesting opportunities in areas that we might not be able to think of. And so that was sort of the second phase, was as we were then, still focusing on the underlying sort of scale up and industrialization of the initial RFID solutions, also starting to open up the foundry model and use that to get a better understanding of what are the broader opportunities for the technology. The final
Okay.
piece then is around the business
Yeah.
model innovation.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the fab as a service that we do not do today. So we're
Okay.
intentionally, as of where we are today, we are focused on having our own fabs, using those to manufacture our own RFID chips as well as support our foundry customers.
Yeah.
But the fab as a service is a potential business model innovation, which is, step change for our customers, because
Mm.
today one of the key issues they have, and this was exacerbated during COVID, is supply chain reliability and predictability. The silicon manufacturing industry is spread across so many different geographies in terms of the different pieces of the puzzle, and a lot of those steps in the process are very concentrated in certain geographies. The most obvious one is the chip fabrication, where a huge proportion of it is done in Taiwan. So being able to offer this option where for our large strategic customers, they can see a
Mm.
route towards not just using our technology for interesting applications, but actually moving that towards having their own fab on their premises that we then
Hmm.
run for them and give them guaranteed security of supply and local manufacturing. That's a really exciting model. It's very different to anything
Yes,
that's done before. You couldn't do that with
that
silicon
is.
fabrication because of the cost and infrastructure requirements. So it's a new opportunity. We think there's massive potential in that, but it's something we've intentionally said, but let's not go that far until we've got a really solid business built around our RFID and
Yes.
foundry offerings.
Yeah, yeah. How far along that journey are you today? Not necessarily the fab as a service in terms of the overall commercialization.
Yes. So perhaps just to complete the picture of the sort of
Mm.
10 years we talked about before was, that first phase of proof of concept, which
Yes.
essentially self-funded, to then building our first pilot scale fab, which showed you could put this in an end-to-end process, which was another 5 years and roughly $50 million of funding to do
Yeah.
that. In the last 3 years or so, we've raised another $350 million plus to scale up the business. So that's included transferring the technology from 200 millimeter wafer sizes to 300 millimeter, which is
Hmm.
the sort of global
Hmm.
state of the art in high volume semiconductor manufacturing. We built our first fab on our new site where we control the entire environment to be able to deliver proper quality, reliable production. We've now installed that fab and it's in ramp up. And
Mm.
are already starting to put in place the elements for our next fab on that site as well. So
Okay.
we are now in what I would term operational scale up, and that's both on the
Yes.
manufacturing side, which is the key enabler of taking the technology and actually ramping up the volume at which we can deliver that to customers. But
Hmm.
alongside that is, of course, the sales conversion. We've got this massive latent demand in both RFID and beyond. We've
Hmm.
got good traction at the
Yeah.
moment, but
Right.
continuing to translate that demand into actual sales contracts as we
Yes.
have the manufacturing capacity to support them is goes alongside that. And of course, there's the organizational scale up at the same
Absolutely.
time, which is never to be underestimated as a challenge.
And you're scaling up most of it in the UK, is that right?
At the moment, yes. So we have a global customer base,
Yes.
and as I mentioned before, one of the key attractions for our customers is actually having localized manufacturing wherever that might be in the world. So in the medium to longer term, we will have multiple locations around the world that
Mhm.
include manufacturing on or close to our customer sites to be able to provide that.
Mhm.
But coming back to this point of sort of de-risking the things you don't have to do at the moment,
Mm.
actually keeping everything in the
Mm.
UK minimizes our risk. It keeps it close to where we've got our existing team and being able to scale that up. And actually, there's also an element there of wanting to build this as a British business and solidifying the critical mass of the company in the UK. So we put a lot of focus into how we ensure the cost structure works effectively. We
Yes.
can bring in the organizational skills we need in all functions to be able to scale the business here. And also on the funding side, be able to bring
Mhm.
in the funding from predominantly British investors to ensure that the critical mass of the business and the value capture is maximized in the UK.
That sounds wonderful, and I'm a strong proponent of that. What have the challenges been, though, in actually delivering on that? Because that's not easy. building British, funding with British. And I know you're very vocal in your views on this, Scott, in the media and so on. So, what have been some of the challenges you've faced, either from, operationalizing and scaling with talent on the funding side? Share with us.
So I think there's a couple of sort of generics which I've sort of seen in every company I've built, but you almost kind of relearn it every time, which sort of reinforces it. Like, it always costs more and takes longer. It doesn't matter sort of how well you plan things
Sure.
and how much you try and factor that in.
Yeah.
The reality of building tech businesses is it costs more and takes longer than you
Especially
expect.
these types of tech businesses.
Especially deep tech, yeah, and so the right investors are critical. Investors that understand the potential, not just in terms of intellectually understand it, but actually emotionally understand it. That they're as committed to the journey as you are, as much as possible, and have an appropriate view on timescales, and that fits with the dynamics of the way their fund is set up and so forth. So strategic investors are actually really key in that, but having the right financial investors is important. And we spent a long time on our Series A before we ended up taking investment from CIC. We turned down investment from a number of other sources that we just didn't feel had the right perspective on the business to be able to stay the course. So sometimes sort of taking longer earlier on pays a lot of dividends later. Second thing I'd say that has been a key learning at Pragmatic is the difference between deep tech and normal tech. And I would sort of categorize my previous businesses as being normal tech businesses. If you think about the three aspects I talked about before, most tech companies actually do a relatively limited amount of innovation on technology. Most tech businesses are using technology in a very clever way to deliver a new product or to deliver into a new market sector. And actually, that's where the innovation is focused. So deep tech, the way I define it, is where your fundamental risk is around, can you make a new technology work? If you do, there is a presumption that the market opportunity is huge, otherwise why bother? So that drives a number of different aspects in the technology. It drives a difference in time horizon, because that definitely does take longer than a normal tech business. It drives different perspectives around how you might fund it, because some of those key technical challenges are just going to take time to work through. You can't necessarily throw more money at the problem to solve it quicker. So picking the key inflection points in when you raise more money actually is a lot more challenging than it might be in a normal tech business, where you just raise as much as you can, and that all helps you move quicker.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of understanding of the type of business you are and where the value creation levers are, how you gradually de-risk things for yourself and for your investors, I think has been an important learning. And then I think the other bit, I guess, is the importance of purpose. It's not something that sort of I'd really thought about much in companies prior to Pragmatic. You kind of you do interesting tech stuff, and you're focused on how do you deliver that into a product and build business off it that will ultimately make money. But actually, what we realized kind of about halfway through Pragmatic's journey was the potential for this was so big that we had an opportunity to be somewhat selective about where we focused it on things that we thought would actually do good things for the world in general. And so even within RFID, we've seen that the biggest opportunities there are around things like enabling the circular economy. How do you ensure that you can minimize waste and maximize recycling or reuse of packaging, for example? How do you enable health tech opportunities, by having electronics that can be embedded into wearable smart patches, things like that. So that purpose, I think, is something that sort of really helped motivate the team in general when everybody's coming to work every day, not just to do cool tech things that might at some point make everybody a lot of money, but actually it's also being drawn towards things that people are proud about the technology being used for, and they're sort of really excited about telling their families and their friends about this is what our technology is enabling people to do that you could never think about doing in a different way.
And you've noticed, and that's had an impact on the performance of people at work, would you say?
Yeah, I think particularly when the journey is so long as it is with a deep tech company,
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think it's one of those things that helps provide that motivation. You go through patches where it's all difficult, and you feel like you're bashing your head against the wall on getting the technology to work the way you want it to, or things like that. And one of the things that helps people carry through that is that they feel like they're doing something that is actually going to be good for the
Yeah,
world.
yeah, yeah. That's true. Scott, you've recently, after your long journey, your 13-year journey, you decided to pass the baton on from a leadership perspective, and talk a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, about that process and about what occurred for you and how that happened.
Yeah, so it's probably worth turning the clock back slightly. My first tech startup was when I was in my early to mid 20s, but my first CEO role, I was still in my late 20s. So, certainly looking back now, relatively young and inexperienced and sort of figuring things out as I went along.
Mm,
But one of the things I did was have a very open discussion with my investors there and said, well, I haven't done the CEO thing before, so let's see how this goes, and let's continue to
mhm,
have an open dialogue about whether I'm the right CEO for the business. Let's have that discussion at least once a year, and my motivation is to make the company successful, not to stand in the way of that if I'm not the right person. And so at Pragmatic, although that perhaps wasn't quite as an explicit and regular discussion, that was always sort of in my mind as well of my objective here is how do you maximize the growth and scale of the business, particularly with Pragmatic. We talked a bit about the sort of UK angle and personal passion about how do you help companies in the UK scale more successfully here. When I look at that, it was very clear that we were getting to a point in Pragmatic where it was beyond what I really had, you know, deep expertise in, and
mm,
also not what I kind of enjoyed and was good at. So,
mhm,
we'd grown to a company that had 300 plus employees, and a lot of the stuff you're dealing with day to day is how do you make that organization work effectively. That's not something that is, I would say, something I'm particularly good at. I was having to leverage a lot of the team around me to help work through
mhm.
that. And equally, having done most of the journey of sort of industrializing the technology, it's now about how do you scale that as a multi-billion-dollar, multi-global business, which again is not something I've done before. So it came to that point where I was saying, actually, if I'm looking at this from the perspective of how do I maximize the opportunity for Pragmatic to be as big as it and successful as it possibly can be, I may not be the right person to lead it forward.
Yeah.
And actually I might not enjoy it, even if I could do that and could figure it out and have the right team around me to support.
Mhm.
If I'm not enjoying the process, that's probably going to reflect on how good a job I do in it. So basically had a very open discussion with the board around that, and we agreed a succession. And I'm so far kind of delighted at how that's going. I think having the right person coming in is key. So it's, I think, relatively easy to find people that come from big companies and see this as an interesting challenge, but finding someone who understands the culture of a business and is sort of sensitive to the differences that we still have. We aren't a big business yet, so yes, we know what good
Yeah.
needs to look like in 5 or 10
Yeah.
years when we are a
Yeah.
multi-billion-dollar business, but there's some understanding of how do you actually take it on that journey and still do that with the right understanding of where we are now and the transitions that still need to happen.
I get that. Um, One final question for you. If you were to look back at meet yourself 14 years ago, maybe even a little longer, and give yourself some advice uh, on how to make the journey easier or watch out for these challenges, what advice might you give?
I think it'd probably be fairly high level in some sense, because
Mm,
actually the specifics are always going to be different in any particular environment. But you know probably the things that I've come to understand are most important is, firstly, work with people you like.
mm,
It is it is going to be a long journey. So, doing that with people you don't enjoy spending time with is not going to be
It's
a
not
good
going to be
outcome for
fun.
anybody.
Mm.
And so that obviously applies to your co-founders and early hires, but equally it applies to your investors, for example. You've got to have
Yeah.
investors that aren't just prepared to give you money and understand the business, but actually are people that you can socially get on with, when you're chatting stuff around board meetings or
Yeah.
things like that. So,
Yeah.
that's probably number one. Secondly, be excited by the journey and not just the end goal.
Mm.
The end goal
Mm.
is going to be quite a long way away and will probably move and change. So actually enjoying the process you're going through. You've got to, not necessarily every day at work. That's probably an unrealistic aspiration, but most days you've got to actually be excited by getting up and getting stuck into
Yeah.
this. It's going to be long years of very long days. So if you're not excited by that as you're going through it and you're just doing it because you think you might make a lot of money at the end of the day, that's not going to take you through the tough times.
Mm.
And then the final thing I'd say is celebrate success when it happens. It's
Mm.
very easy to always be focused on the next thing you need to do. You kind of get one key milestone and there's so much more you need to do, and there's always more that you need to do. So I think just sort of actually taking a bit of a pause and celebrating, saying, yeah, we've done something that was really hard. We know there's an awful lot more we need to do, but actually this was something that was really tangible and difficult, and we've done it and nobody else ever did.
Yeah.
How do we make sure
Yeah.
we're actually
Yeah.
happy about
Yeah. Yeah.
having achieved that?
Yeah. Some wonderful insight. Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Lab to Market Leadership Podcast, brought to you by Deep Tech Leaders. This podcast has been produced by Bauhaus. You can find out more about us on LinkedIn, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.